All right, we're doing things a little differently today. We're going to, instead of having all our music up front, we're going to have a little preaching and a little music and a little preaching and a little music. And then toward the end, we're going to have a great slideshow Robert's put together concerning the VBS. So give me just a second. I wanted to start off with a story. Many years ago, I would say probably in the late 80s or the early 90s, there was a terrible fire in Chicago, apartment fire. And I guess what happened is this family there in Chicago, there was an entire family, grandparents and everybody, children, grandchildren, all living together there. And apparently the grandfather went out down a hallway one way, and the rest of the family, maybe in the smoke and the chaos, went the other way. But tragically, after it was all over, I remember watching this on the Chicago news. What happened was that the buildings burning to a crisp, and some of the people that got out in time are standing there and just horrified. And this elderly black gentleman, he's standing there and he finds out that his entire family was lost. He was the only survivor. And the news people came up to him and they found out that this was the case, and they said to him, "What do you do? How do you think? How do you deal with this?" And the wise old gentleman said one of the most amazing things. I couldn't believe what came out of his mouth, but this is what he said. He said these words. He said, "God ain't never made no mistakes. God ain't never made no mistakes." Folks, I don't know about you, but that is a huge level of faith right there. To be able to say something like that, most of the times when things like that happen, the words that come out of our mouth is why? Why? Why, God? Why? And this man's like, God doesn't make any mistakes. God doesn't make any mistakes. So today what I want to talk to you about is this simple topic of how to think properly when trouble strikes. That man knew how to think properly. He knew how to think biblically. So like I said earlier, what we're going to do is we're going to weave Scripture in with music today, all right? And so I hope that you'll really enjoy it. It's a little bit different. But let's just talk about this. What you choose to think about, and what you choose to focus on in life has one of the most impactful it's one of the most impactful things that'll ever happen in your life, apart from, coming to know the Lord and having the indwelling of His Holy Spirit. After that, what you're focusing on and what you're thinking about is very, very critical. In fact, if you're serious about going from here spiritually to here spiritually, don't we all want to make progress? Don't we want to get better and better for God? Well, if you're serious about that, there's only really one way of that being accomplished. And I want to show you the verse here. And I'm taking this from the New Living Translation. You're all familiar with the old King James where it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But the New Living Translation says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world. In other words, it's talking about the culture around you and I. Don't copy the behavior and customs of this culture, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think, by renewing of your mind, changing the way you come into the Christian life with all of the old backup tapes from the old life, okay? You got all the backups from when you were unsafe, and you bring those with you, the old baggage. But you know what? You have to start thinking differently. And the way you think, in other words, your perspective about life makes all the difference in the world. The man we just spoke of, that elderly black gentleman, man, he could have been there sobbing and crying, and I'm sure he cried and I'm sure he sobbed. But you know what? When he was being interviewed, man, he just stood up and he said, you know what? I can't give you the reasons why this happened, but I know this. God ain't never made a mistake. Whatever God has allowed, He's allowed it for a purpose and a reason, and something good, somehow, some way, is going to come out of this, even though I can't tell you what it is. So when you have the right perspective on problems, notice I have the Bible in the brain up there. If you're seeing things God's way, when you have the right perspective on problems in life, you can handle almost anything. Hey, don't all of us agree that at some point in time we're going to get hit with something that we didn't expect, that we didn't want? Okay, but when you have the wrong perspective on problems, why? And the guy's got his hands in his why? What? When you have the wrong perspective on problems, you can handle almost nothing. I mean, life can get very, very depressing, very, very dark, and very, very difficult. Now, you know who in the Bible had the right perspective? Is Job. I don't know if you know this, but Job was the first book of the Bible that was ever written. A lot of people think it was Genesis, but actually Job was written before Genesis, even though Genesis talks about how everything began, and they put it in its proper spot. That's the way you would want the Bible to start. In the beginning, God. In the beginning, God created. But Job was this man who's the most wealthy man on earth, and he had 10 children, and he had flocks and herds, and I mean, he was just very, very wealthy. I mean, just way up there. He had a huge family, 10 children, and he had great health, but you know what happened? Job had everything, and he lost everything. There was a tornado, and all of his 10 kids were in this home, and the home got leveled by the windstorm, and all 10 of his children were killed. Think about that, everybody. Those of you that have children, have grandchildren, think about that. In one swipe, this very, very godly man, in fact, God said about him to the devil came and said, that guy only follows you, God, because you made him rich. If you took away everything he had, he'd curse you to your face. And God says, okay, let's see. Let's give him a test. Well, he took away his children. He took away all of his wealth. It got stolen. And then he got really, really sick. And from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet, he was covered with boils. Man, I'm telling you what. Talk about misery. And he was miserable. But guess what, everybody? And this is what we're going to sing about here in just 2 seconds. After Job went through all of this, lost his children, lost his wealth, lost everything, this is what he said. The Lord gave. The Lord has taken away. Now, his wife said the next word out of Job's mouth would be what? Cursed be the name of the Lord. Curse God and die, Job. Curse him and die. You're miserable, Job. God's mad at you. He's through with you, Job. He's angry with you. You got secret sin, Job. No. Job said, honey, the Lord gave, blessed me, prospered me. The Lord chose to take it away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. There's somebody that knows how to think when trouble comes. When times are good, I praise the Lord. When times are bad, I praise the Lord. Blessed be the name. That means praise be to God's holy name. In other words, praise be to God. God is in control. All right, so right now, we're going to sing that very song, Blessed Be Your Name. Well, like I said earlier, one thing that all of us know is that we don't know what's going to happen to us on any given day. We never know what's going to happen. We don't know if a day, let me just drop back to that. We don't know if a day will be full of trouble or not, okay? But we do know one thing. We do know that trouble is something that we're all going to have to contend with, and that's why I said we need to get the right thinking, okay? So how should we think about trouble? What outlook? It's about an outlook. It's just like we learn to view trouble as God's people. We learn to view it in the way that God would want us to view it, okay? When trouble comes, should we say, oh no, why? Why is this happening to me? Is that how we should respond? Is that how we should think? Or should we have a different perspective, a different outlook? All right, so here's lesson 1. We had it up there a minute ago. When your situation is depressing, notice D, because we're going to give you 3 Ds this morning. When your situation is depressing, you must think about God's goodness. We just sang about it a little bit there. We're going to sing about it again here. We're going to have an offertory here in a moment. But we're going to talk about God's goodness. See that little warning light I put up there? I got that off the internet because that's a warning light on some car. Oh. Is that it? Yeah? Okay. I don't know what it was, but it's not good. It's not good. Depression is like a warning light on your car's dashboard. Okay? Depression. And when we're focusing, what it's telling us, when that comes on, and it might beep, it might make noise, I don't know, but it comes on and it gets our attention. When we're depressed, one thing it's telling you and I is that we are focusing way too much on the negatives that are going on in our lives and not the positives. Folks, listen, we're living in the greatest nation on earth. The poorest people in America are like kings compared to the rest of the world. Seriously. And I mean, there's poverty in America, and I hate it, and some people even go without food for a period of time, and things in their life are very terrible. But I'm just saying, compared to what people have to endure in the rest of the world, there's no place like America. And yet it's so easy for us as Americans, maybe especially for Americans, because we have it so good. If the least thing goes wrong, we start complaining. Well, I want to tell you this story and then share a Bible verse with you. This girl named Missy Jenkins, back in December of 1997, on that day in her high school, an armed gunman went into her high school and gunned down a bunch of people. Missy Jenkins survived, but unfortunately she got clipped in her spinal cord by a bullet, and what it did, it left her dependent. It didn't make her a paraplegic, but it made her dependent on wearing braces and using a walker in order to get around. She's only 17 years old. At the time of the shooting, she was 15 years old, and she described herself as, quote, without direction. She said, I didn't have any direction in my life. During her convalescence, she not only found the will to stay alive, but the determination to go forward in a positive direction with her life. And here's what she said, quote, I realized I did not die that morning. You see how she's thinking on the positive? I'm still alive. Yeah, I can't walk and run like I used to. I have braces. I have to use a walker. But guess what? I'm alive. I'm living. I'm breathing. She said, I did not die that morning. I'm all here. I'm alive. On December 18th, 2004, now you're going from 1997, December 1st, 1997, you're going forward 7 years to December 18th, 2004. That 15-year-old without any, what did we say earlier, direction in her life, she graduated with a bachelor's degree from Murray State University, and her future plans included a master's degree, marriage, children, and a job. And this is what she said. I love this quote. Missy said this, I just don't think God is going to give me anything I can't handle. I just don't think God's going to give me anything I can't handle. Folks, that's the proper perspective in life. And we've got to latch on to that. We can't let all the horrible... And you know what? We complain too easily. We find it so easy to complain. King David went through tons of trouble in his life, but I love this verse. I love this verse right here. By the way, in that tree, it just says the word blessing, 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 blessing. But David said this, how great is the goodness you have stored up for those who fear you. You lavish it on those who come to you for protection, blessing them before the watching world. How great is the goodness. You remember I said when times are depressing, focus on God's goodness. David had tons of trouble, but he focused on God's goodness. How great is the goodness you've stored up for those who fear you. You lavish it on those who come to you for protection. So, folks, when trouble comes upon you, don't focus on the problem. Don't focus on the trouble. You'll get depressed. Okay? Say, hey, look, I'm still breathing. This is happening to me. This is good. This is good. Look on the good things. Focus on those things. Don't look at all the negatives. You just say, hey, Lord, you're allowing this, but that's okay because you've got a purpose for it. And focus on God's goodness. Say like that man said earlier, God ain't never made no mistake. Get that attitude in your mind. God's not made a mistake. Okay? You know, a family that would have been here today probably, or I think they were going to go on maybe on a trip, but, Chester, his grandson, his daughter's boy, Dane, he was here every day for Vacation Bible School. He was here Friday night for the lock-in. And Dane, there's Dane down there. Hi, Dane. And he won the medal, didn't you, for your grade? He won the big medal, yeah. And so anyway, but Dane didn't know that, that night, his mom, she was in a car wreck that night, and thank God she's going to be okay, but, her face was banged up and her teeth and things, and, she was here taking pictures of them. Boom, out of nowhere comes this car wreck. And so, what we need to realize is that's the way life is, and we need to have the proper perspective. God, you allowed this. I'm not going to curse you. I'm going to say, blessed be the name of the Lord. Blessed be your name. And I'm going to trust you that you never give us anything that we can't handle. So far, well, right. We've learned, first D, is that when your situation is depressing, that you must think about God's goodness. And that's what we just sang about. Great is your faithfulness. Does God ever quit being faithful to us? No, He never leaves us. He never forsakes us. He's there. He's right there with us, even though sometimes we feel like He's a million miles away. So that's number one. The second lesson here, the next D, is when your situation looks defeating, you must think about God's greatness. First, His goodness, but now you need to realize His power. You need to realize how wonderful and powerful and great He is, and that He can help you. He can see you through. He can help you endure. In Psalm 77, this guy's in a bad strait. He is crying out to God, but he just feels like God's not listening, okay? And so you get to Psalm 77, the first 3 verses, and man, it looks like it's a long night. He says, I cry out to God. Yes, I shout. Oh, that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long, I prayed with hands lifted toward heaven, but my soul was not comforted. In other words, he wasn't listening. That's how he felt. I think of God, and I moan, overwhelmed with longing for His help. So as you can see, he's crying out, he's yelling out to his Father, and yet, for whatever reason, it seems like God's not listening to what he's asking him to do. And so that's the first 3 verses. Sometimes troubles come upon us. They seem impossible to solve. Marriage problems, financial problems, family problems. What I love about Psalm 77 is that the writer doesn't focus. When you get to verse 4, he doesn't focus on how impossible things seem. He focuses on God's greatness. Now, the first 3 verses, he's in a pickle, but then he probably checks himself. He probably says, hey, he slaps himself and he says, hey, why am I thinking like this? This isn't how I'm supposed to think. And you get to the next several verses here, verses 10 through 14. This is a little bit later in the psalm. And it says, I said, this is my fate. The Most High has turned His hand against me. So he's still kind of negative there. He says, well, I guess I just got to live with this. Obviously, God's angry at me. But then he says, hey, wait a minute. My sins are confessed. I'm not flaunting. I'm not living in sin. I'm not thumbing my nose at God. I'm walking with God. God's not angry at me. He says, but. First he says, this is my fate. God's turned his hand against me. He's punishing me. No, he says, but. Then I recall all that you've done. See, right there, he starts getting his thinking focused, like you and I need to. When we're depressed, we need to focus on God's goodness. When we are in this strait this man is in, we need to focus on God's greatness. When it looks like we're defeated and we're not pulling out. I remember, he says, I recall all you have done, O Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. Yeah, what kind of God are you? God, the people were about to get murdered by the Egyptians coming out of Egypt. And the Jews were fleeing from the Egyptians, and Pharaoh and all his chariots. He had tons of armies. They're coming after us. And what do? You open up the Red Sea. I remember that. Man, you're powerful, God. You're not a weakling. He says, I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. They're constantly in my thoughts. Now he's getting in the right place. I cannot stop thinking about your mighty works. Oh God, your ways are holy. Is there any God as mighty as you? You are the God of great wonders. So if your problems seem overwhelming, they seem defeating, it seems like you're in quicksand and you can't get out of them, you need to think about this. There is a hand reaching down to you out of heaven. There's a hand. And my friends, it is a mighty, mighty hand. It's reaching down to you from heaven. It's so powerful. It's done miracle after miracle after miracle for centuries. And with his hand, Jesus can pull you out of your problems. Now listen, in his time, we're so impatient as Americans, but God says, hey, I want you to suffer. I want you to be like Job and have boils on your body. I want you to go through trouble. And afterwards, you're going to come out better. Job came out. He had twice as many children. Guess what? Job had 10 more children. I thought you said he had twice as many. He did. He had 10 on earth and 10 in eternity. So he had 20 children. He had 10 more children. He had twice as much flocks. God gave him back twice as much. I mean, God richly blessed him, but man, Job went through an awful period of time in his life. Horrible. So Jesus has done these miracles and wonders for centuries. With his hand, he can pull you out of your problems. Listen. He can pull you out of your problems if you are willing to listen carefully. You have to listen carefully. In other words, you've got to be thinking. You've got to be hearing the Word. You've got to be reading the Word and be thinking, okay, Lord, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts and see if there's any wicked way in me. Lord, I don't think there is, but let me be thinking. See, in other words, you've got to have the right thought process. You got to say, Lord, have I failed you? Or Lord, am I just being tested by you? But either way, are you just testing me, Lord? Are you maybe upset with me about something? But you start talking to God and be thinking carefully, listening carefully, following his directions, because Jesus is mighty to save. He's mighty to deliver us. You know what, everybody, we've got people in our midst today that are in their 80s and in their 70s and in their 60s, and they've been through the knocks, the hard knocks in life. And they can tell you, you know what? God ain't never made no mistake. Yes, I went through this and that, but you know what? When I look back on it, God had a purpose for that, and I'm glad that God did that because he's helped me. He's taught me about himself. He's taught me that he's mighty and he can deliver me. Yes. He's taught me about himself, that I can trust in him. And so what we need to realize, God specializes in the impossible. He specializes in the impossible. He wants to help you. Trust him to help you. And remember, God ain't never made no mistakes. All right. The first Lesson: when your situation looks depressing, you must think about God's goodness. God is good. He's in control. He's working all things together for good. I got to trust Him. Number 2, when things look defeating, when your situation looks defeating, you must think about God's greatness, His greatness. And now, lesson number 3, the third D. When your situation looks dark, you must think about God's closeness. God's closeness. You know what? Sometimes you cry out and you cry out and you cry out and you pray and you maybe even fast, but it's just as if the heavens, and you see the clouds I put up there, they're very dark. Sometimes, let's see, where are those clouds at? Is this it? Oh, there we go. Yeah. The dark clouds. I pulled that picture for a reason, because sometimes that's the way we feel. Wow. We just don't understand, and everything looks dark and dismal. It's a day when all hope seems gone, a dark day. It's a day like where you can't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and you feel like God's abandoned you. And there will be times in life when God seems a million miles away, and it seems like He doesn't care about you. That's the way it seems. It just feels that way. And it's in those times you need to think about how close He really is. Let me give you an example. Let's see, it's been now 14 years. 14 years ago in July 2003, July of 2003, I was standing up here. I was all excited because I was starting a new sermon series on the book of 1 Peter. And right out of the blue, I'm up here talking, and I was talking about Peter. I was explaining about Peter, the man Peter, who wrote the book. And all of a sudden, I couldn't talk. Many of you were here. But I'm standing up here, and I'm going, Peter was humble. Peter was humble. Dane, my associate pastor, did just what you did. He was sitting back here, and Jeff's like, Jeff's back here laughing because he thinks I'm doing some kind of trick on everybody, you know, that I'm talking that way for a reason. I wasn't talking that way for a reason. I couldn't talk. And I was like, for 1 minute and 20 seconds. I have a recording of it on CD. But I was like, Peter, humble. And then I said, I'm sorry. And I tried to apologize. And in my brain, it's so weird because in my brain, I'm thinking, Bob, why are you talking like that? Why are you talking like that? Quit talking like that, Bob. But I couldn't. What happened is a tumor in my brain had taken over what my body was doing. So instead of me talking like a normal Yankee, okay, instead of talking like a normal Yankee, I started mumbling and saying all these crazy things. And I was trying. My brain knew what to say, but I just couldn't do it. And then after about 1 minute and 20 seconds, I said, oh, wow, I don't know what happened there. Okay, well, let's continue on here. You know, and everybody's like, Jeff was up here laughing, and he thought it was just a skit or something, you know. But anyway, what happened was, after they found out I had a brain tumor, I decided, instead of just going right into the operating room and having him, it was about a golf ball-sized tumor and a little bit of a golf tee going down through the bottom of my brain. The tumor was round, and then it went through a hole in the bottom of my brain. And so, instead of jumping right into a surgery, I said, you know, talked with Kelly, and we said, hey, you know what, let's try to whip this thing through a good diet and through vitamins and through special like natural things. Sure, let's try it. So we started that, and unfortunately, the doctor that was helping us with that, he wasn't monitoring my calcium, right, Kelly? Calcium. And I got overloaded with calcium. And of course, I was having grand mal seizures anyway during this time, because the tumor would press against my brain to such a degree that I would pass out, and then they'd have to call the ambulance and all that. But you know what? I woke up in the Baylor Garland. My kidneys had started shutting down, and I was just miserable. I was in mortal pain, and my kidneys weren't working. They thought they were going to have to put me on dialysis. All kinds of things going on. And I got up out of the bed, and I walked over to a concrete wall, and I just put my head against the wall. And as I was leaning my head against the wall, I began to pray. And as I began to pray, I was saying, Lord, I don't understand, and I'm really struggling right now, and I really need your help. I almost died, Lord, and I really need to know if I'm going to overcome this. And, I just started to pray. I can't remember everything I said, but you know what, everybody, I'm not kidding. I didn't hear a literal voice, an audible voice that you could hear like you hear my voice, but I mean just as if God was sitting on my shoulder over here. He said this to me. He said, Bob, I will never leave you or forsake you. I will never leave you or forsake you. And you know what, everybody? That was good enough for me. I got back in bed, and then later on, I wasn't able to shrink the tumor at all, so that started in July. In January of 2004, I had 9 hours of surgery. The awesome doctor, he stayed at the stuff. He was only supposed to operate for 4 hours. And the anesthesiologist, who was my friend, Dr. Doug Murphy, he said, Bob, most doctors would have sewed you up and put you on chemo and radiation. He said, Dr. Barnett kept going and going and going, and he got that whole tumor out. And folks, 14 years later, thank you, Lord. So that doctor, he needed something from God, I bet. He said, I'm going to keep working on this preacher. I'm not giving up. I'm praying about stuff too. So he kept going. But anyway, I love this verse. The antidote to dark days. The antidote. It's to think about God's closeness. That's the antidote. When you're just having those days where it seems God has abandoned you, you need to remember verses like this. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. When you're brokenhearted, when you feel like God's a million miles away, guess what? He's even closer. Wow. God is awesome. So when you're experiencing dark days, when your situation looks dark and impossible, you must think about God's closeness. You don't know who this is, but if I say her name, many of you will know who that is. This is Joni Eareckson Tada. This is when she was about 16 or 17. She was really athletic. This is back in 1967, okay? She was 17 years old. This girl loved sports. She loved to run. She loved to do horseback riding and race horses and to do the equestrian where they're jumping over the hurdles and all those things that they do in equestrian. Well, that summer, she was out on a lake, out on the dock, and she dove headfirst into the water, but she didn't realize how shallow the water was, everybody. And her head hit the bottom of the lake, and it broke her neck. And suddenly, at the age of 17, Joni Eareckson Tada was a paraplegic. She could only move from the neck up. Everything below her neck, arms, legs, everything was destroyed. She's a paraplegic. She would be in the wheelchair the rest of her life. But, and believe it or not, it's 50 years. This is the 50th anniversary of her breaking her neck in 1967, this summer. And Joni Eareckson Tada said, in spite of the difficulties these past 50 years, she said, you can endure almost anything if you know God is right next to you. You can endure almost anything if you know that God is right next to you. And you know what, everybody? Here we are again. She's 67 years old. She was 17 when it happened. Now she's 67. She's spoken all over the world. She's been with presidents. She's been with Billy Graham. And guess what, everybody? She's an accomplished artist. She puts the paintbrush in her mouth, the little long skinny one with the tiny end on it, and she dips it, and she paints intricate paintings. Takes the time, and she paints these beautiful, beautiful paintings. In fact, somebody bought one for Kelly and I, a small one. Bought an actual, I think it was an actual one, for our wedding many, many years ago. But Johnny Erickson Tata, she could have thrown in the towel, said, God, see how you care for me? See? Look at my life. It's destroyed. I can't move. God sent her a wonderful Oriental man that married her, Mr. Tata, and he's blessed her, taken care of her, loved her. They wrote a book together. You can buy that book, and it talks about their love relationship and how awesome God has done all these wonderful things. But she's an amazing, amazing woman. You can endure almost anything if you know God is right next to you. All right, one more story and one more song, and then we're going to watch our VBS video. All right? Okay. Yes, Lord? I'll hurry. Okay. Okay. Author Richard Exley, this man's name is Richard Exley, he wrote the following. I know one minister who returned to his pulpit 10 days after his son committed suicide. This preacher returned to his pulpit 10 days after his son committed suicide. Under incredible stress, he read this text. And we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, who are called according to his purpose. He read that to his church family 10 days after his son committed suicide. He was visibly struggling. He said from the pulpit, quote, I cannot make my son's suicide fit into this passage. It's impossible for me to see how anything good can come out of it. Yet I realize that I only see in part. I only know in part. It's like the miracle, this pastor said, it's like the miracle of a shipyard. So you watch these giant ships that carry people across the ocean or go on cruises. These giant ships, they're made of metal. Metal that weighs a lot, like the propeller or pieces of the ship. He said if you were to take those pieces and throw them into the ocean, he said they would sink immediately. But he says the amazing shipbuilders, after they take all those pieces and put all those pieces together, then that ship goes down a launch and it flies down into the water, and suddenly that heavy, heavy ship and all those heavy parts are floating, and the ship is virtually unsinkable. But wait a minute. Steel doesn't float. Steel doesn't float, it sinks. He said, taken by itself, my son's suicide is senseless. But throw it into the sea of Romans 8:28. Throw it into the sea of Romans 8:28, and it still sinks. It still sinks. But I believe that when the eternal shipbuilder has finally finished, when God has worked out his perfect design, even this senseless tragedy will somehow work to our eternal good. I think that's a great, great illustration. I think that's awesome. And so, folks, the reason that we as God's people can think that way, the reason that we as God's people can think that way, even when days are depressing, and even when days are defeating, and even when days are dark, The reason we can think that way is very, very simple. God ain't never made no mistakes. Say that with me. God ain't never made no mistakes. Don't ever forget that. When your days are difficult, when they're defeating, when they're dark, when they're depressing, God ain't never made no mistakes. Let's sing. We're going to sing